Dissent. What does that term mean? Basically, it means to disagree. When you debate a topic, there are dissenting opinions. When a union goes on strike, that is dissent against the actions of the managers. So what does dissent have to do with liberalism? Well, everything. The reason the early philosophers like Voltaire fought for freedom of speech was because they realized we needed to allow dissent in order to create a better society. Remember, the Enlightenment was a time of powerful monarchies who would control what the people could say, or even wear. Allowing the people to criticize the government allowed for the revolutionary change to democracy, and today it keeps those democratic governments in line. But is there a point where dissent goes too far? And who gets to decide what the dividing line is? There are laws against things like violent protest, but couldn't it be argued that sometimes violence is needed to overthrow a government that's abusing its power? Let's talk about civil disobedience. That's a form of dissent where citizens refuse to follow certain laws in order to gain influence over government or to change government policy, but they don't turn to violence. For example, in Alberta, many rifle owners didn't agree with the long gun registry and refused to register their guns. They're breaking the law. The political parties saw this action, and when the Conservative government gained a majority in the House of Commons, they cancelled that long gun registry because of those protests. Civil disobedience can also include picketing, boycotting, unauthorized rallies or marches, even events intended for mass arrest. What? People wanting to get arrested? Yeah. When women were fighting for the right to vote a century ago in Western countries, suffragettes would hold illegal parades or rallies, which would then bring the police in, and the women would demand to be arrested for breaking the law. The jails would then be full of women, which would gain the attention of the public and the media, which then allowed the suffragettes to get their message out. Two of the more famous individuals who used civil disobedience were Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. King said he wanted to emulate the actions of Gandhi in his fight for civil rights. Gandhi wanted Indian independence from Britain. He knew that the Indian people could not defeat the British Army, so he encouraged his followers to do things that would irritate and frustrate the British. For example, Indians had to purchase salt that was taxed by the British, but many of them lived by the ocean, so Gandhi encouraged them to go and collect their own salt. But that was against the law, so it's civil disobedience. Eventually, the British did agree to leave India, and Gandhi is a hero in his nation-state. In the United States, one of the pivotal events in the civil rights movement was the act of Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on the bus, again, a form of civil disobedience. Her arrest spurred on protests around the country. For example, in Montgomery, where that bus incident occurred, locals boycotted the buses for months, led at times by Martin Luther King Jr. This boycott was a form of dissent. There were many different groups that evolved during the U.S. civil rights movement. One of them was the Black Panthers. They were a more radical arm of the movement that grew impatient for change and were willing to turn to violence in order to gain attention for their goal to create a Marxist society. Their reputation for being willing to use violence to promote Black power overshadowed the great work they did in communities, building medical clinics or providing breakfast programs for kids. But everything they did was to try and focus attention on police brutality and racism in the United States. So if the Black Panthers were willing to use violence as a part of their dissent, does that make their efforts less legitimate than those of Gandhi, Rosa Parks, or Martin Luther King? The hippie movement was going on at the same time as the civil rights movement. These were the baby boomers who had become disillusioned with government. One of the big issues the hippies dissented against was the Vietnam War. Many mainstream Americans felt that the hippies were being unpatriotic and tried to have the protests shut down. Remember, an unauthorized protest is against the law. But what if the government won't authorize your protest? One of the worst events was at Kent State, where some anti-war protesters were shot by the National Guard trying to break up the protest. Today, many people agree that the hippies were actually right and that the Vietnam War was a mistake, and there was much less resistance against the anti-war protests in the 2000s. What about the land claims protests in Canada? We've had many peaceful protests trying to draw attention to the conditions on reserves or the lack of progress in land claims court cases. But then there have also been some violent protests. You've probably learned about Oka or heard of Ipperwash. Most Canadians agree that First Nations groups in these cases were mistreated by the government, but don't agree on whether violence was necessary to draw attention to the issue. Did dissent go too far when people are getting hurt or even killed? Was that necessary to bring attention to the injustice? There are also groups that use shock to get attention to their issue. Is putting paint on a bystander's fur coat an acceptable form of protest for animal protection? A nude parade? Burning down a resort to send a message to protect wilderness areas? How about spiking trees to prevent old-growth forests from being cut down, or ramming boats that belong to whalers or shark fishermen? There's pamphlets or signs showing an abortion, or pictures of a girl being burned in a car accident caused by drinking and driving. Do you feel like some of these protests are acceptable but others aren't? What's the criteria you're using to decide who should be allowed to express themselves in a free society in a radical way? A modern liberal would want to protect freedom of speech, even if they disagree with the message, but they might be torn about whether or not using violence that impacts others is acceptable or not. In 1999, there were riots at the G8 summit in Seattle. The focus of the violence was Starbucks. Protesters said they were attacking the Starbucks stores because this capitalist institution was taking advantage of the coffee growers. This collectivist group wanted us to be more aware of the conditions of the workers. And it worked. Many coffee companies today offer fair trade coffee and fair trade merchandise and fair trade chocolate. So maybe the violence was acceptable. On a much more global scale, some violence was necessary in the Arab Spring that brought democracy to many North African countries. We all know dictators are not going to give up their power without a push. The people in these countries filled the city square night after night, letting their government know that they wanted democracy, and many of these nation-states are now becoming democratic. Yet that freedom to protest can make an existing democracy even less stable. A perfect example are the political protests in Thailand from 2008 to 2010. The colors of the two main parties, red and yellow. When the red party was in power, supporters of the yellow party would protest until the red party was willing to step down and let the yellow party have the power. Then supporters of the red party would protest and create chaos until the red party got their power back. This included things like shutting down the airport by filling it with protesters or blocking main streets so businesses can't work. Usually these protests are legal, but really frustrating. So in the end, there are so many different examples of dissent, and the issue is, when is dissent essential for the progress of democracy, and when does it just make things worse?